Hey everyone, this is Push to Prod and it's Dan here. Before we get into the show today, I thought I'd start with a brief intro for you. Colin is currently away travelling. He's having a good old time with his family in the UK. And since we can't catch up live together and share our usual summary of what we've been up to, we instead decided to produce an episode that is a little more evergreen. The topic we've chosen to get into is Saas hosting, since it's something we all have to consider at some point if we're building and running a SaaS. You'll notice in the recording that we also have a bit of fun experimenting with the format. The first part of the show has a bit more of a storytelling feel to it, just to set the scene. Later in the show, we get into more back and forth casual style. Like I said, we're simply experimenting here with a few options since we're a young new podcast. On that, given we're still new, could you do us a favour? If you like this show today, do you reckon you'd be able to drop us a line really quickly and just let us know what you think? Equally, if you dislike this format, let us know as well. We're definitely open to feedback here. You can reach us on Twitter at pushtoprodpod or send an email to pushtoprodpod@gmail.com. Okay, that's it for the pre-show intro. Let's get into the actual show, shall we? I hope you enjoy it. Hey everyone, this is a Push to Prod SaaS Builder Session, your guide to understanding options for building, running and growing your software as a service. I'm Dan Miller.
And I'm Colin Gowdy, and this is Season 1 of Push to Prod SaaS Builder Sessions. This season, we're opening up the data center and looking at all those infrastructure pieces that make production possible, aka hosting.
So over the coming weeks, we'll call class into session and bring you one big idea per episode, like what serverless functions are or when would you level up to private cloud.
Now, we do realise that learning about hosting and infrastructure might seem like a questionable activity of someone who's trying to build a SaaS. Shouldn't you be building new features or running a new marketing experiment or something?
True, Cole, but that's the beauty of Push to Prod SaaS Builder Sessions. You can do both. SaaS Builder Sessions are developer experience enhancing and feature-friendly guaranteed. No trolling through tabs, no dealing with brochureware, just fundamental SaaS principles in a simple, consumable format delivered right to your earbuds wherever you are. So the thing that I love about various SaaS hosting options available nowadays is that they make it so much easier to turn your SaaS dreams into reality. They help you take the amazing code that you've built on your local dev machine and put it into production for others to use anywhere in the world.
Yes, gone are the days of building a machine yourself that sits under a desk in your office or configuring some operating system, connected to the internet, keeping everything patched, dealing with a barrage of constant cyber intrusion attempts or possibilities. Today, you can have a virtual team of professionals that specialise on all this just for you.
And in this Season 1 episode of Push to Prod SaaS Builder Sessions, we're getting started by exploring the world of platform as a service. So we may as well start with a backstory. We start by going back in time to the olden days, before SaaS existed. Back in the 70s, 80s and 90s, most big software systems for businesses ran on-premise and were built by several teams of people that each played their part. One of those teams were the infrastructure crew, and they knew all about building and running the hardware that these business software systems ran on. Think mainframes, server farms, things like that. If you were the software team building the code, whenever you needed machines to run your software on, you would speak to the infrastructure team and they would help you set things up. They would also take care of running all the machines in the back rooms and the basements. This harmonious world of on-premise systems development cruised along nicely for years. The software teams did their thing, the infrastructure teams did theirs. In parallel to that, you also had software developers building and selling shrink-wrap software that could be installed via floppy disks or CD-ROMs on individual personal computers. Again, those personal computers, they were managed by infrastructure teams in the business or the owners themselves in the case of privately owned machines, right?
And then along came the internet. For the first decade or so in its infancy, but after a while, people began to realise that you could provide a service where you built and ran software systems for other people. In this new world, users could log in not by connecting their desktop computer via the local network to the on-premise mainframe or server, but via their browser over the internet. The beginnings of a software as a service industry was born. Businesses and end users loved this since it meant they no longer had to run their own computing infrastructure on-premise. They could just pay someone else to do it, i.e. the SaaS provider. Still in those early days, if you were that SaaS provider, you still needed to take care of all the infrastructure yourself. Now, one important point to remember is that developing business software and managing computer infrastructure are two very different skills, and it took a lot of time and effort for SaaS teams to do both, and it's not easy.
So, as is the case, whenever there is a challenging problem, savvy entrepreneurs see a solution. And sure enough, over the years since SaaS began, we've seen several businesses spring up whose main offering is building, configuring, and running the infrastructure that SaaS software developers can simply pay to use. Cloud hosting was born.
Cloud computing or / hosting in general is a fancy way of saying other people run IT infrastructure for you on their own machines in a separate location, and you connect to and use via the internet. There are several different flavors of hosting available, and one of the current offerings that makes life easy for SaaS developers is platform as a service. The core concepts of PAAS are this. Third-party providers deliver many of the behind-the-scenes components then to run a SaaS, like the hardware infrastructure, the back-end server software. These components are provided out of the box. They're managed in some shape or form by the PAAS provider, including many of the components that SaaS require on top of infrastructure, like easier deployment for, or database upgrading systems or framework-specific features. For example, there's server compute, storage, load balancing, network configuration, firewall, all of this. All of this is the responsibility of the PAAS provider. And the SaaS team can simply pay the service fee and utilize all that out of the box to host their app and its data.
So, Cole, I figured at this point, I probably would love to talk a little bit about some of the pros. As someone who is starting up a SaaS myself, this is very interesting to me. So from a point of view of why it's attractive. PAAS to me, it makes me think that I only need to focus on building and operating the app and its data. I don't need to worry about all the other stuff. So like we said earlier, knowing the ins and outs of hosting infrastructure, configuration options, monitoring, scaling, that's a specialized profession in itself, right? I remember you used to do that sort of stuff. You have actually quite a bit of skill in that space, but it can take years to know what's required to successfully run SaaS infrastructure in production. I don't have it. So time spent on hosting is time that you don't have to further develop SaaS or to get out there and focus on marketing and sales. Therefore, if someone's willing to do this work for us and all you need to do is input your credit card, it's a no-brainer. So I reckon some of the pros of using a PAAS include time savings, reduced infrastructure management, and automating or eliminating some of those maintenance tasks. Have you got any thoughts about what you might think are some of the pros as well?
Yeah, look, I mean, obviously it reduces the complexity of what you sort of alluded to at the top of actually setting this up yourself. Some of that complexity is you don't need to have these skills in-house. So you can actually, you don't have to hire. Suddenly your HR becomes a lot simpler. Staying up to date with, the software and some of the new technologies or even versioning of certain things, that's all taken care of. And not only running, but scaling. So sometimes running infrastructure is one thing, scaling it is another option. So some of these PAAS ones make it so easy.
That's the bit that scares me actually. And I love the idea about a PAAS provider coming in and being able to scale that for you. It's the, I don't know if people remember, but there used to be this really cool original website where everyone would go and talk about, tech stuff. And it was called Slashdot. Its website is slashdot.org. And there used to be this thing called the Slashdot effect. Whenever an article turned up on Slashdot, or everyone saw it, if it was about a specific company or a specific business or a specific website, every single user of Slashdot would just dump in and go to that website straight away. And before you know it, it'd be super busy and it'd just crash. That's the Slashdot effect.
And it became a verb, wasn't it? You got slashdotted. Yeah.
Yep. So scaling scares the hell out of me. And I love the idea of a PAAS provider just taking care of that for me. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. I reckon some of the other benefits you'd have with it would be the fact that you don't actually have to physically have these things on premise anymore. You can actually, because they're provided by a PAAS provider, you could be anywhere in the world and be able to deal with some of your back-end stuff. You could just log in, right? Yeah.
Yep. And then obviously that speed to market. Now, because you're not having to do a lot of that thing, you're building your SaaS, especially some of the frameworks that are out there now. They come with almost a one-line script to be able to take what you've just written, push it into one of those PAAS providers and you're up and running. So that speed to market, that ability at an early stage to get it into production, it's just mind-blowing compared to where we were 5 or 10 years ago.
It is pretty good, actually. It's cost-effective as well. Like, the fact that I can go and just punch in, I don't know, some of those start at, there's a few free plans, but there's some of them start at like $7, $10, $15 a month, and you can have your own little server infrastructure doing what you need to do. That's super cost effective. I don't need to spend thousands of dollars on a server anymore. I don't need to spend thousands of dollars in time taking care of all that. So yeah, I really love that. And one of the aspects which is definitely a pro, but it could also be a con, is the security side of it. Again, not knowing what buttons to press, what configurations to switch on, which things to switch off, that could be a bit of an issue. So having a PAAS provider deal with that for you is possibly a good thing.
That's right. So, I mean, many of these pros probably have their associated con as well. And obviously, I was thinking going through some of them, and like the security element, like you're saying, like I think out of the box, when you think about using a PAAS provider, it is obviously one of the things you get and you think about. You go, yep, they're going to fix it. I won't have these random ports open anymore and things like that. But then there is other security things that come along with it, because if you're not thinking about it, you can still have holes, especially like some of these vendors, you might be deploying containers to their system. So now you've got to still think about what vulnerabilities are in my frame, like inside my container that I'm using. Some of the, you're still building up effectively an operating system inside a container, or your code, who writes everything anymore? You definitely are using open source frameworks in your actual code. That's still got that vulnerability. So you're not, just because you're using someone else's infrastructure and their platform services doesn't totally mean you can forget about it. So I think a lot of those pros have these associated cons. But the good thing is when you're really little, you don't have to, you can sleep easier at night. I guess you don't have to worry about all the time.
That is true. I guess if they get it wrong though, they get it really wrong. So if your PAAS provider doesn't do the right thing from a security point of view, and like you said, Cole, if you're not thinking about that, it can be probably pretty disastrous, yeah?
Yeah. And so like some of the other cons, I mean, look, reduced flexibility of control, I guess, in the sense that most of these, because they're like configuration, like convention over configuration, all that, they're like saying, look, if you do it this way, there's less for you to do. But as a result, you've got to do what they want to do. And most of the time that's fine. But if you're coming from the history of building everything yourself, or you used to do it a certain way, or particularly in my case, sometimes I'm used to deploying to these cloud platforms a certain way. So for me to then choose a different PAAS provider or vendor, it's suddenly I'm trying to go, okay, but can I do this on it? Can I do that? Like, how does that work? And so they're things you got to think about in terms of, like, is this a negative for me, or what can I forget about now? It's not so much a negative, but it's like, what assumptions can I ignore now because I don't have to worry about it?
I guess they probably lock you in a bit as well, wouldn't they? Like if I'm loving the fact that I just need to give them my credit card and I start building my app around their infrastructure, I could actually inadvertently find I'm putting myself into a bit of a cul-de-sac here, painting myself into a corner by locking myself into their way of doing things and their infrastructure. Therefore, it could be a bit tricky to get out of later on down the line. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the thing. And you're always going to have some element of that, aren't you? Like if you're thinking about choosing, for example, AWS or Azure as like a cloud provider, you could think, okay, well, if I go AWS and I go real native AWS, I'm going to get locked in pretty quick. And then that same thing happens if you step up to the PAAS environment, where if I'm in a Heroku, how easy is it to jump onto another one, and that's fine. And what you do find, I think, but look, this is what we're using these platforms for too, is it to validate our idea? And we don't care about that. But once we scale up a bit, you just have to be very conscious that if it requires you to, eventually, I don't know, go back to say native cloud, like to AWS, what else do I need to build now because I don't have some of these platform features that are there?
I guess some of the other cons you want to be thinking about as well is, availability. If the vendor has an outage themselves, like the PAAS provider has an outage, then your software as a service is going to have that outage too. So you want to make sure they've got some high nines in their uptime and their availability. And that probably goes with performance issues as well. If you're, you're purchasing one of the lower tier value services that they offer on their PAAS, you're probably going to be lumped in on a shared machine of some sort behind the scenes, and therefore, you're probably at the whim of whatever else is going on those machines. So you could experience some performance issues, and some of them actually they deliberately do that just to make sure that they reduce the amount of performance you get, so that you will push yourself up into the higher ranges as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and you'll definitely see that, like especially, I mean, I haven't used Heroku and things for a while, but if your app is one that is not used a lot, and it's like, say it's a business app used during the day, you'll probably find in the morning it's totally off. Like it's available but not available.
Yeah,
it's asleep and
it
it's going
goes
to
to
come
sleep.
back up. So, and if your API is like that, you just got to know that my initial requests are going to take a bit longer, then they're going to come up. But again, they're cons, but they're also, you know why you're doing it. Yeah.
I experienced that myself, Cole. The very first time I started using one of these PAAS providers, I was freaking out because I was going, what's going on my dev machine? I'm running my site and it's pretty much instantaneous. Sure. Why is it taking me 35 seconds for my site to load on this PAAS provider? And I was going, right, I figured it out.
Yeah.
Because it goes to sleep in the background. It's the database is going to sleep. The server it's running on is going to sleep. The container that it's on. Yeah, that's explain it. So once you know how it works, you know how to deal with it.
Yeah, and obviously, like you said, they want you to pay a bit more to, to keep it awake, or maybe the speed to come up is quicker. And that's where you get into the other con, which these can be quite expensive as you grow. And like personally, I've got a little bit of that in the sense that I'm quite comfortable with Amazon ECS, which is not really it's a PAAS in a way, it's like containerized, framework. But I was talking to a guy at MicroConf last week, and he was like, he's a Rails app. I think he's Rails app, but his bill is like $60 a month. Mine's like, even at my scaled down ECS usage is, I don't know, $250 a month. It's just because I've got all these things hanging off it. And it just shows you that depending on the things you choose to use, they can get quite pricey. And that's still cheap. Like, let's admit, $250 is cheap.
Can.
But then you get the other end, like the DHH of the world with Basecamp, where they're bringing everything off the cloud back to behind the firewall because the amount they're spending is just ludicrous. And it's actually, well, at least they're doing the maths where it's cheaper, ironically, to go back and run everything themselves, which is kind of, a full circle. Okay. But again, that's a con in a way, but it's a con that you just have to be conscious of. I think if you're at that point where it is, if cloud is more expensive for you, then you're probably in a pretty good place.
Yeah, I'd say so as well. I was actually going to consider that as one of the things we talk about, is when would you start getting into PAAS and moving into other spaces. But I'll get to that in a minute. So people are probably thinking, listening to this now, who are some of these PAAS providers? Give us some names. We've mentioned one or two so that can become real in their heads. So some of the lists that I've found, I actually put the call out on Twitter the other day and I said, I've made a list. What do you think? And most people got back to me and said, yeah, that's pretty close to covering it. Some of the ones we've got there are Heroku, you've got Render, there's Fly.io and Railway. And another one that I just heard of for the first time was Porter. Have you got any others on your list, Cole?
There's the whole DigitalOcean app platform, Google App Engine. If you're in the Microsoft world, I'd argue that, Microsoft Azure App Services is a PaaS provider. And then, some of the other guys was mentioning Platform.sh. I haven't actually used that one. And Engine Yard, if I'm right, Engine Yard is Rails, isn't it? I guess that's the only other thing. I probably should have written down what each of these platforms are, because I guess one of the things with these systems are they're only going to be applicable to certain frameworks or languages. And
I think the main thing that they sell themselves with is, and this is the takeaway from the episode here today, is that basically they take care of everything for you, but you come along, you've got to provide your app. And you've also got to deal with your data. So you've probably got to look after your database. Even though some of them do provide the database, you're the one who's sort of in control of that. So that's the main push there. So that's the list of PaaS providers. So that brings us to the next question, which is, when would you use them? Why would you use a PaaS?
Yeah, so look, and we've obviously alluded to it a little bit in our discussions at the top, but they're going to suit people or organizations or startups. Like, obviously, they have fewer resources to develop and manage applications.
That's me.
And therefore, you benefit from like this out of the box, ready to use, all in one offering, for your software delivery, hosting, stuff like that. So, like we just mentioned, if you're starting out like you are and you're building a new SaaS, someone like me who's, I guess, not so much starting out, but we're small. We need to know that we're not going to obviously deploy all this ourselves. Or you might still be new or whatever, but that you're not going to have the sort of the scaling up requirements. So you just, you want to run it cheaper. You don't have many users yet. You're trying to validate an idea. That's when a PaaS provider is obviously definitely worth considering.
Yeah. I like that one as well. If you're pivoting around and you're playing around with new ideas, you're just saying, I'm going to try this, SaaS idea for the next few months, or I'm going to try that one, and maybe do a few of them in parallel. Having a PAAS is actually quite an interesting idea there, because you can move super fast. You don't have to think about anything. You don't have to muck around with infrastructure. You just punch in the credit card, buy the service, connect your app up to it, and start deploying there. You're there. You're ready to go. So I like that idea for sure. You'd probably want to think about it as well if you've got relatively less experience or skills building and operating application infrastructure, then PAAS is probably something that you want to think about.
Do you think just a question on that, this is a hard one for me to answer because I just don't have this, but if you were pretty much a non-technical person or a no-code type developer, is this still something applicable, or is it still needing that? Do you think that someone who's choosing and deploying on a PAAS provider, it would probably still be technical in the sense that they've built the app?
Yeah, you'd probably want to have a decent comprehension of, it's the stack that your system is going to run on, and you make a conscious decision to not do parts of it yourself. Whereas someone who's like super in the brand new technology space and I don't really understand what I'm dealing with, I'm here, I'm just doing no code and I'm just running it, I probably suggest maybe it's not the right choice for them, because you've actually got to comprehend what it is you're buying and what aspects you'll want to purchase from the PAAS provider.
Yeah, that's what I would have thought. But it'd be interesting if other people, if there's other people out there who know more about. So I'm not a no-code person. I'd be interested if there's sort of the equivalent of what this is. I guess it is. I guess the no-code environment that you're using probably provides some of this. Do you know what I mean? So it's probably a PAAS in itself. Yeah.
Yeah. So I reckon another reason why people would use a PAAS is, you just want to prefer to focus your available time and effort on building and marketing the app instead of working on the back end infrastructure. You've gone in there, you've built your system, you've built your minimum viable product, and you want to start marketing it. And to be honest, you just don't want to muck around with infrastructure. You don't want to deal with that issue. So go and buy the PAAS that's there available to choose from. I mean, it's a fair option. And as we pointed out before, though, don't forget those cons. At some point, you are going to have to face up to them. You can't just keep kicking that can down the road.
It would be interesting, again, to know what the biggest – I'm assuming there's some pretty big apps that run on these providers and they work just fine. Someone like me who has the background of how to, probably that DevOps background, you tend to probably for your own curse sometimes do more of this yourself because you want to know how it all plugs together. And so sometimes I personally am a Rails guy and I've thought about moving and doing some smaller stuff, just small little tiny micro SaaSes in Node to learn more. And it's like, hey, well, that's when I would use this because then I don't have to take the baggage of what I've had before and I can use it in a fresh new light. So pretty excited about that.
I'm already, I'm playing around with PAAS for sure, but I'm already investigating options for what I will do when the time comes for starting to get a little bit more down into that stack further. Yeah. Because I know I can't use PAAS forever. And I've had a chat to a few people behind the scenes who are running their own SaaS, and it's surprising the scale of usage that people have there. Some of them, they're right up there on the PAAS end, whereas others are literally right down on the other end, which we'll probably talk about in another episode, of literally running their own bare metal servers in their own location and taking care of everything of connecting it to the internet and making sure it's running. So there is a wide range here. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, I think it's one of these things you sort of alluded to it. It's like you got to do what you're comfortable with and what isn't going to take your time. So if you think you can spin something up quickly because you've got your scripts, you've whatever, then you're probably better doing that than trying out and going through 2 or 3 passes until you find out which one's more applicable. So again, it is a little bit of, you got to look at what your comfort level is, how quickly you can get something up in order, like you alluded to, is the value that you're trying to do here is build the product, and solve clients' problems. So.
Cole, this was the beginning of season 1 in our mini-series in hosting, and this was episode 1, Platform as a Service. Folks, we hope you enjoyed the experiment we ran today. It was a little bit different, as you probably have heard. We're having a bit of fun with it. We're seeing how it goes. So, yeah. Yeah,
and hopefully these are a little bit more, I won't say evergreen, but maybe they're things that people can go back to over time if they're, having that particular question. These podcast episodes can sort of live in perpetuity a little bit, rather than just be always just an update. we'll hopefully tend to get one of these out every week or every other week around our other podcasts where we keep you guys up to date and informed of how Userlot and Dan's investigations are going.
Yeah. So folks, thank you and enjoy your journey on hosting. We'll talk to you again in another one. So thanks for listening. And remember, you can reach us on Twitter at pushtoprodpod or email the show at pushtoprodpod@gmail.com. You can also find us directly on Twitter at Gomo or Mr. Dan Miller. Thanks for joining us, folks. Cole, it's been a pleasure.
Until next time, mate. I'll talk to you next week.